Please listen carefully.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd episode of the Study Space podcast, a show dedicated to helping students like you earn better grades, navigate your college journey, and become lifelong learners. My name is David Chung, content strategist at Uniplan.
And my name is Julian Vu, the founder and lead software engineer at Uniplan.
Before we get into the episode, we wanted to thank you all for tuning in to listen to the Study Space podcast. Be sure to give us a rating on Apple Podcasts and share the show with your friends. Joining us today is my friend Joey, who is also an upcoming sophomore at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to the podcast, Joey, and I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, David. So, as you guys know, my name is Joey. Like David said, I go to Johns Hopkins University. I'm an upcoming sophomore. My intended major right now is neuroscience, and what I intend to do with that is eventually go into the field of pediatric neurosurgery. But as some of you may know, that's very far in the future. But other than that, in my spare time, I love to play bass, piano. I like to dabble in a lot of music. I've started to record some more. And I'm also a guy that just likes to play video games here and there. So, yeah.
That's awesome. And obviously, before we start the episode, I like to ask every guest what's inspiring them today. So, Joey, if you don't mind.
That's a great question. Today, I'd have to say something that's really inspiring me are all of those healthcare workers working on the front lines of the pandemic. They never asked to be put in this situation with the pandemic and to have to fear a lot more at their jobs than usually they would. So with that oncoming and added stress onto the people working the front line, anyone, whether they're a surgeon, a nurse aide, a nurse, a regular physician, it doesn't matter. They're my true inspiration because they're the ones really going through everything with the pandemic now.
All right, Julian, you want to go next?
Sure, happily. So what's inspiring me today is a YouTuber named Brad Traversy. He produces a lot of tutorials on YouTube for coding projects, whether it be web programming, mobile, even I think he recently published a video on, or at least a video series on data structures and algorithms to prepare for those algorithmic interviews that plague the software engineering industry. So he's done a couple of videos on those. And the reason why I mention him is because I've recently gone back into interviewing for different software engineering jobs. And there was one interview in particular that I really enjoyed, actually. So it was not an algorithmic interview, thankfully, because I really don't like those. I have my own gripes about them. But in this interview, the interviewer, the actual manager of the team for which I'm hoping to work for, he gave me a couple of projects to do. So he gave me 3 projects, and I was to choose 2 to complete. And each of the projects tested different bases of knowledge. So web programming, JavaScript libraries, and such like. Don't worry if you don't know what these mean, but it's just, it's a bunch of different technologies that are used to develop web applications in production for different companies and such like. So I didn't know a lot of the technologies that were asked of me to do for these projects during these interviews, but I wasn't going to give up. So I took these projects as an impetus to learn a new technology. And so the source that I went to was Brad Traversy, and he has hundreds of videos, maybe even thousands of videos at this point, on different technologies for web programming, and watched a lot of the videos there, learned how to build something. I was able to finish the projects for the interview. And then now I have another technology under my belt that I can use to build a different kind of web application. So even if I don't land the job, I've learned something new that I could put on my resume. I can build new web applications with this technology that I've learned. And that is what is inspiring me today.
Yeah, so what's inspiring me today is the movie The Help. So, there's been a lot of events recently after the death of George Floyd, and Black Lives Matter has been a really prominent movement in the last few months, and there's a lot of stuff going on right now at the moment, and one of the most watched movies on Netflix right now is The Help. And the reason why is because it tackles the problem of racial inequality in the United States. Specifically, I believe in the 1960s, approximately. I'm not sure if that's correct. I'll correct it in the show notes if anything. But it's basically about the black maids who were called the Help in the South, basically in Jackson, Mississippi, I believe specifically. And it's a really great movie. I think everybody should check it out if you're living in the United States. It's a great story about how black people were treated really, really unfairly in this country, even just a few decades ago. We think it's like a really far gone thing, but it's pretty recent, and it all reminds us that we should always be striving to do better, and we should all be striving towards racial equality. So that's what's inspiring me. So now we're going to get into the questions that we've been waiting for. So Joey, first question for you. What inspired you to want to pursue a career in medicine, and what motivates you on a daily basis to keep going with your pursuits?
Well, that's a big question, David. I have, over the years of, throughout this journey we all call life, throughout my, collection of experiences, I kind of accumulate little inspirations along the way, but I'd have to say my main inspiration would be my great-grandfather. As I said, I had wanted to go into pediatric neurosurgery, but not until last year it was just neurosurgery, because my great-grandfather suffered through a brain tumor and unfortunately passed away from it. And being so young to witness all of that and to witness the heartbreak it had on my family, for me, it just kind of, I never really understood any of it because I was only 2 or 3 years old, but I would see these guys in white coats constantly walking into the hospital room, and I would ask my grandmother, my father, my mother, I would ask them, who are these people? What do they do? And they would tell me they're brain doctors, eventually brain surgeons. Eventually they would tell me they're neurosurgeons, and I kind of caught on to it. And, when you see these guys walk into a room, these men and women all come into a room and do their best to help save a life, I don't think it matters what age you are. It's kind of something that captures you in the moment. And ever since then, I've been wanting to be that guy wearing the white coat. And after doing my own research throughout the years, learning stuff more through public education, through Johns Hopkins, I get to learn more about the brain. And surprisingly, and which is my best case scenario, it's something I love to learn about. And it gets interesting as far as I go. So my basis would have to be my great-grandfather. But the thing that pushed me towards pediatrics is that I don't think any child should ever have to go through brain surgery. It's such a huge and traumatic thing for someone to go through at any age. I don't think a child should have to. And if I wanted to dedicate myself to something and it still had to do with the brain and neurosurgery directly, I would want to be the one trying to alleviate as much of that pain and trauma and suffering as I could for those children. But what motivates me to keep going is definitely my family. Being the first in my family to go to a university, to even think about going to grad school, it's something that's pretty big in my family. And whenever I feel down about something, my mother and father, I'll talk to them about it, and they'll say, well, you'll get it eventually. You'll be fine. You got this. You always do. You always have. And they're the ones that keep pushing me. They're the ones that when I worry about getting into medical school only as an upcoming sophomore, I know it's premature, but they're the ones that'll say, any medical school will be lucky to have you. And I think any support like that is crucial to help people get into this kind of field where it's very hard to find that kind of support,
Yeah, no, I think that's a great inspiration, and I'm glad that you have such a supportive family. I mean, I can't personally say the same, but my parents do eventually, come around and give me my support. But no, I'm really glad for you. I think it's great, especially in a field that's so difficult like medicine. I mean, I think there's a lot of doubt in every pre-med's mind. Would you agree with that? Like, just because it's so selective getting into medical school, you're competing against the best of the best, and I don't think I've ever met like a doctor that I could call dumb. It's just not, that's not a thing.
Yeah, of course. A lot of these, speaking for me and some of my friends that are pre-med, a lot of them just hear percentages. Like, oh, the national average of people, of pre-med students actually getting into medical school is 35%, 40%. I need to be in that top 35, 40%. So listening to numbers alone, and we're not even talking, that's just medical school. Imagine people trying to get into a decent college. And then from there, you think about the percentages of matching into your preferred residency programs. Those kind of things are those kinds of things are what really can discourage a pre-medical student from going into numbers and percentages, because we know numbers and percentages don't lie. But I urge every pre-med student that may be listening to this to keep pushing forward. And the worst thing you can do is worry about those numbers. You need to focus on yourself. If you focus on yourself and you put your best effort into it, then at the end of the day, I'm sure you would make it. And if you didn't, at least you have no regrets because you put your best work into it.
Yeah, that's a really great piece of advice. I know that, I mean, as an engineer, and I know that Julian's a computer science major, and you're obviously a science major as well. We all like to fall into this thing of like facts and figures and numbers and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, I think it is important to acknowledge like why we're doing the things we're doing. And yeah, just taking a step back and saying, you know, I'm going to work on myself. And, you know, if I don't make it, then that's unfortunate. But you know, the journey along the way is definitely important to think about. So you mentioned that you're a neuroscience student, and obviously you talked about how you're interested in the brain, and that's probably why you chose neuroscience. But obviously, it's more traditional, I'd say, to choose something like biology or chemistry as a degree that will lead to a career in the medical field. So, what specifically, made you choose neuroscience over biology?
This is a very good question. Um, to be honest with you, I just really love the brain and I wanted to learn more about it. And, the school where you and I are both at, David, Johns Hopkins, they're top ranking in the country for neuroscience. So it was kind of very hard for me to pass up. But a lot of students do end up choosing biology or chemistry because of the fact that it closely relates to the MCAT and all of that. But for me, I didn't want to think too much about that. I didn't want to choose that major because for any pre-medical student listening to this, your major does not matter when you apply to medical schools. They don't care at all what you majored in. It really makes no difference to them. And I'm speaking that from my experiences and from what I picked up. I've never heard any medical school care about your major. So major in something you like. Major in something that captures you, that entices you, that makes you want to learn. Because not everything is about the GPA either. You need to learn something. You need to take away something from your college years. So if you had to pick something to learn, why don't you pick something you enjoy? Some people, honest to God, might like biology that much or chemistry that much to do it. And for them, I say, good for you. But for me, I love the brain. So that to me made more sense to choose over something as biology or chemistry. You have people applying to medical school as English majors, anthropology majors, computer science majors, engineering majors. And there's nothing wrong with that. Doctors should come from a variety of different backgrounds. And I think that if you're planning on going to medical school, you should make your college years something, you should make them focused on a degree that you find enriching and that you want to learn the most about while you're there.
Yeah, that's definitely a great point. I mean, you're the third pre-med student that we've interviewed so far, and all three of you guys have different majors. You, Andre, and Natalie, all three of you have completely different majors. And I brought this up, I think, with Natalie too. She's majoring in chemistry, which is kind of like a traditional major, but it's definitely not as traditional as something like biology. And major really doesn't matter. There are definitely physics majors and music majors who have gone on to medical school. I know personally, I know an electrical engineering major who wants to go into medicine. The reason why is because he's interested in developing medical technology, medical devices. So yeah, I think that's great advice. Doing whatever you're passionate about and then worrying about getting into medical school later, because I mean, really anyone can take the MCAT. And
Exactly.
I think actually a statistic is that math and physics majors actually end up doing better than biology majors on the MCAT. So that's pretty interesting to think about. It doesn't really matter, doesn't really prepare you more than if you were another one of those majors.
And can I jump in here? I just wanted to say, David and I share a high school as an alma mater, and there's an English teacher who is just an institution at this institution on his own. And he's famous throughout the school for the guy that talks about college every single day. He's the kind of guy that like preps you up for college. He gives a pep talk about college nearly every single day. He isn't fearful of taking some time out of the curriculum to talk about college for like 15, 20, or an entire class period sometimes. And there was a guest speaker, because he would regularly have guest speakers come to class to talk to us about their experiences in college and such like. So there was one person who came by, and he was a Spanish major. He did Spanish as his undergraduate education, and then he ended up going to med school, and now he's a doctor, but his undergraduate degree was in Spanish. So that just goes to show, you know, that degree really doesn't matter. And he liked Spanish. He enjoyed Spanish enough to get an undergraduate degree entirely in Spanish, but he also decided he liked medicine too. And, you know, what does that say? It says that your application is a little bit more interesting when your major is like David said, not quite traditional, you know, from a traditional biology background. He chose Spanish and got into med school, and now he's a doctor. And I think that was cool.
Exactly. And that Spanish major could certainly help him in his application, because nowadays they would love doctors and medical professionals to have some sort of bilingualism, which is something very important. I'm lucky enough with my half Latino background, specifically Colombian, I can speak Spanish on my own just from learning from my family. And that's a huge thing in the medical field too. If you speak multiple languages, I was just working at a nursing home throughout the pandemic, and the fact that I spoke Spanish was huge, because they would always ask me, can you please translate for me? Please translate for me. That's something that a lot of medical professionals are looking for in their field of work, people to translate for them, so that they don't have to constantly call the blue phone in the hospitals and have a translator on the line and have all of that confusion going on, when they can just have them right there in front of you. And sometimes even doing the same work as the medical professions there.
Yeah, it's definitely a great point. I think knowing another language is great, not just for medicine, but for any career in general, because, you know, you can work in another country perfectly fine, and you can help people in this country who may speak a different language. Definitely a great point. And you mentioned obviously that being a Spanish major has its advantages, because then you know another language. Do you think that, you know, picking neuroscience has any advantages for a pre-med student over picking something else?
Well, to be honest with you, I think each major would have their own specific set of advantages, of course, for medical school, but neuroscience specifically, a lot of the neuroscience classes, like in my case, well, in our case at Hopkins, the general classes that we must take as a neuroscience major are nervous systems 1 and nervous systems 2. And I was talking to some people that went to medical school, and they said that classes are kind of outlined in the same way as those major classes are, where you have to memorize a lot of stuff quick and basically cram it in a way, but still learn it, retain it, and learn how to apply it in different ways on exams, which is it's very similar with how medical school classes operate during the first 2 years of someone in medical school, of being in medical school. Those first 2 years, you're learning all of the information rapidly. You have to cram it in. You have to memorize it. You have to learn how to apply it. All of that happens rapidly. And I think the neuroscience major can offer that as like a pretense of what type of class you might expect in medical school during those first 2 years when you're learning everything. Also, as a neuroscience major, you can take many of these other classes I'm about to mention without being a neuroscience major, but they do count towards the degree. So you can take classes such as functional human neuroanatomy, which would definitely share a lot of similarities with your neuroanatomy class you would take in medical school, or a simple just anatomy class, or in our school we take a neuroscience lab, which focuses a lot on the anatomy of the brain. So I think all of that really comes into play in medical school too, because you have to memorize all of those basic structures in medical school. If you're like in your neuroanatomy classes in medical school, you have to memorize those basic structures. And doing a neuroscience major, you have the advantage that you should already have them memorized by the time you get your degree. Or at least you have, if you don't have them memorized at that point, you can at least brush through it a lot easier than anyone else would, I'm sure.
Yeah, so would you say that neuroscience is particularly difficult relative to other majors, or would you say it's probably about the same as something like biology or chemistry?
I would say neuroscience is, in my opinion, more difficult, only because of the fact that a lot of the brain hasn't really been discovered, and a lot of the stuff we learn may not be as concrete as something like Krebs cycle in biology. You know, it's like a lot of stuff in biology that we learn has been set in stone and it's very well founded, but it's not the same thing in neuroscience. And neuroscience, the last class I took last semester, cognitive neuroscience, not all of it is hard science. Cognitive neuroscience was a psychological approach to neuroscience where you're examining the cognitive basis of the neuroscience, the basis of cognition, essentially. And that can be very tricky too, especially when you're learning how to apply it in various ways. And I just feel like a lot of other majors lack that sort of application that neuroscience requires. Like nervous systems 1 and 2 in our school, we don't memorize things and just get asked multiple choice questions about them. We memorize them and then we have to apply them in very specific scenarios, which isn't something you would find in other majors that I've heard of in our university.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty interesting, and it does actually sound like neuroscience is considerably harder than another major. So obviously that's academically pretty rigorous. So what are some study tips that you have used personally that have worked for you and helped you get better grades?
Well, the thing I hear a lot, especially in this major and in a lot of other ones that are very content heavy, is that people have to memorize everything. That is not true. Please don't ever try to memorize anything, because first and foremost, you'll go crazy. Second, you'll stress yourself and probably get gray hairs earlier. And third, you won't have enough time to, trust me. So why bother? So the thing I usually do is I don't memorize things. I try to understand them in a very general way. And I try to connect certain aspects of what I've learned so that I don't have to memorize it per se, but I can understand and I can make it common sense. I can say, if this happens, then of course this would happen. You know, that kind of thing. And to be honest with you guys, when I was in high school and I took AP biology, my AP biology teacher was insane and made us memorize a lot of stuff, but I never memorized any of it. I would walk around in my room and repeat the thing over and over again, but I wouldn't memorize it word for word like some people try to do. I would just make it common sense to me. I'd understand it. There's a very big difference between memorizing something and understanding it. If you memorize something, you know the textbook definition, but if you understand it, you don't have to remember the textbook definition. You can just say it however you want, as long as it's correct. So I think the basis of it, the best way to make something work for you and to make a class really work for you is to make the content like a second nature, like a common sense. Practice it hard and rephrase it over and over again until it actually makes sense to you. Don't just memorize something because you were told to. That makes no sense to me.
Yeah, that's definitely really interesting. I mean, I always hear this kind of negative stereotype that, you know, all the pre-med majors have to focus on memorizing all the time, and there's lots of information, and, you know, you probably won't remember any of it in a while, but you have to get through it anyway. And that's really interesting. Like, you brought up a kind of contrary point of view, and I think that that'll probably be helpful for anyone who wants to go into medical school, because knowing that it's not just about memorizing all the time, I think that that's definitely going to help them get better grades. I mean, I speak as an engineering major here, but obviously in my field of study, I can never memorize. Like, you just can't memorize. There's like certain formulas and everything, but they give those to you anyway on the test. So you just kind of go through it and you learn how to apply it in very specific situations, like you said. So yeah, honestly, it sounds like you're describing engineering. I mean, that's literally what I do on a day-to-day basis. Julian, you want to, join in on that discussion?
Yeah, you know what? It's funny because in software engineering, you go through classes oftentimes, and I've experimented. You know, I like to think about how I think, and I love to think about how I study and how I learn, because it's just something cool that I think about. It has to do with the brain, right? So I think you can relate on some level, Joey. Just thinking about how we learn, how knowledge gets sort of realized. And I thought about that a lot in university. And so obviously I experimented a lot with different study techniques, different ways to study, different ways to read, different ways to understand and learn. And I was willing to experiment with my own grade, like put my own grade and my own GPA at risk just to do that, because I was like, hey, you know, like, if anything, I can just go back onto something that I know works, so that I can pull that grade up if need be. But I'd like to try different things here. So I've experimented with the different techniques on how to study and such like. And personally, for me, I resonate with the whole, like, don't try to memorize everything idea, because in computer science and in software engineering, of course, I would be lying to say that like memorization, you know, doesn't help. Like, that's a lie. Memorization does definitely help when it comes time to like do something on the spot. You know, sometimes it's like, oh, well, you know, 2 to the 6th power is 64. So, you know, when there are 6 bits, it's there are 64 different combinations of numbers that you can do. And that's like something I can pull from the top of my head, and that's useful for like certain things. But like, you know, I'm never going to need to know that. I can just look up like, what is 2 to the 6th power, right? And that's just one simple example, but there's a million other things that I've been told to memorize by all of my professors. And, you know, and I memorize it in the moment, maybe in preparation for an exam, but shortly afterwards you forget, because your brain sort of files that away as not really important information. And that's okay. That's okay. It's okay to forget things. It just means that that bit of information just hasn't come up enough such that your brain interprets it as something important that you need to remember. The beauty of that is whatever you do have in your head is something that your brain does consider to be important. And that's probably the knowledge that you use on a daily basis, right? So in my head, I have a couple of recipes that are in, you know, my cooking repertoire that I can just make right away without any reference to any sort of recipe. And that's important because I like to cook, and I like to cook every single day. And especially now when everything is supposed to be closed, now that everything's opening up again, you know, you're supposed to cook for yourself, right? So then now I just, you know, it's important information to be able to just whip something up really, really quickly instead of spending an hour reading a recipe. And on the flip side, for engineering, I know a lot of things about code. I know a lot of things about how different programming languages work. And that's just useful because certain programming languages exhibit different behaviors, and it's important to differentiate between the behaviors of different programming languages. And that's just something that I need to know, because I work with, you know, I can work with like 5 different programming languages on the same project at any given time. So it's important for me, at least, to know the differences between the semantics of every single programming language. And that's just knowledge that I need to know in the moment right now. Whereas, you know, if you taught it to me in university, like all of these different subtle differences between different programming languages in like year 1 of university, yeah, I might have studied it for an exam. Yeah, I probably would have aced that exam, but would I have remembered it going into year 2? Probably not. But I need to know it now because it's important with my work. So my point is, memorization is great for immediate recall when you need it in the moment, but you know, you only need to value that memorization when that knowledge is indeed important enough for you to just remember it. In which case, you don't really need to study anymore, because then it just sort of naturally, you just sort of naturally remember what you need to remember, right? I think that's the cool thing about memory.
Yeah, of course, I definitely agree with that. The point of learning these specific ways is that you shouldn't be memorizing something to an extent where you're making yourself go crazy. You should be making it a second nature, like you were saying. Because if you memorize something, whether it's engineering, physics, biology, cycles, mechanisms, and organic chemistry, whether you memorize something in its complete extent, no matter what it is, you will make yourself go crazy. And in a profession, in this case, a medical profession, where The road to get there is very long and very hard. You don't want to burn yourself out before then. You want to extend yourself so that you're able to survive the journey and make it there. Because if you burn yourself out quick, you won't have the motivation left in you to keep going. And I think just solely memorizing a lot of these hard topics without really understanding them is what kind of dims the flame that keeps people going on this long journey.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, so warning, I'm going to go a little bit off script here. So you talk about how there are times where, you know, a lot of classes sort of force you into memorizing, right? Like everybody tells you like memorize, read this book like 4 or 5 times, read this chapter 4 or 5 times so that you really sink it in, right? So there's a lot of pressure. And then obviously we've talked about the sort of stereotype, the underlying understanding that memorization is, you know, the end all be all of a pre-med track, right? So you talk about driving yourself crazy when you're trying to memorize all these things. There's a sizable coalition in the medical community, and I know this because I'm marrying a medical professional. So there's a sizable coalition in the medical field that says and believes that that's all part of the journey, is experiencing that burnout and sort of testing your mental stamina. You know, do you have the mental stamina to go through medical school or to be a hospitalist or you know, whatever field you decide to pursue within the realm of medicine, right? So I want to know your opinion about that philosophy, where it's like, well, memorization and burnout is all part of the journey. You need to learn how to deal with burnout. You need to learn how to deal with driving yourself crazy, because that's just what's going to happen. And if you can survive that, then you deserve to be a doctor. But if you can't survive that, then maybe you're not cut out. So what's your opinion on that?
That's a really good point. That's definitely given me something to think about, but I don't think it's truly necessary, because the way I see it, a lot of doctors I may know, they go through college and it's hard, of course, for them. And then they go through medical school and it's harder. They go through residency and it's a grueling process. And of course, the burnout levels get higher and higher, and you should be prepared for that. But a lot of them look back at their college years and say, you know, I wish I just had a little bit more fun. Even though now they can have fun as a doctor and, you know, they get the nice paycheck and all of that, and they can really do a lot of stuff that they couldn't before. It's different when you're young, though. And a lot of people may look at that as seeing a failed opportunity to really enjoy their young adulthood. And I understand the process includes a burnout. I've experienced burnout before. I'm talking about how memorization isn't the way, but I've experienced burnout before too. Because even if you don't memorize everything and you try another approach, sometimes there's so much material that either way you still face a burnout. You still face sleepless nights, or sometimes sleepless nights consecutively. And I think either way you would still get that burnout and that experience that prepares you to have more burnouts in medical school, and that prepares you for those crucial 24-hour shifts during residency. And if you're going into a very specialized surgery, it can prepare you for those long 10, 11, 12, 13-hour surgeries. So the burnout is surely a crucial process, but I just don't think, in my opinion, memorization isn't really the most enriching way to go about that burnout. I think there would be better ways to go about the burnout, and I don't think the burnout should be experienced as much as it is experienced by pre-medical students, in my opinion.
And that's a good point, right? It's that, like, memorization, yes, might add to the burnout, but what you're saying is that there are perhaps other ways in which burnout can sort of creep in, and that'll give you all the practice you need and all the, I guess, mental preparation you need once you get to that point, right?
Yeah, that's what I've been focusing on. But Again, I'm only a rising sophomore, so my opinion may not be set in stone. Ask me again in about what it would be from now, probably 14 years, and I'll give you a much better answer, I promise.
Yeah, I'll probably take you up on that.
Terrific.
All right, so moving back, obviously, to your, you're only a pre-med, like you said, and it's important that you focus right now on getting into medical school. And I'm aware that one of the ways you're doing that is by doing research at, I believe it's the Johns Hopkins Medical School, actually. So, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing there and what your job entails?
Yeah, of course. I'm actually working with Dr. Agnetti's lab. He focuses on the cardiological biochemistry aspect of medicine, and it is at Johns Hopkins Medical Institution. He's an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins Medical School in both biochemistry and cardiology. And the research we've been doing there has really focused on heart failure. Heart failure is something that is still not really understood today, even though most people know the term, but no one really truly understands what happens that causes heart failure. And that's what the lab I work at, Dr. Agnetti's lab, that's what his lab focuses on. He focuses on the mechanisms of heart failure because he believes that if we understand the mechanism for why the heart goes into failure, they may be able to devise better treatments and diagnostic tools. So that's just the background of what we do. Of course, I could go into the specific protein biochemistry, all about it, but I think that's honestly something that's still a little over my head and I don't truly understand, but it is fascinating and it's very interesting work. A lot of the work I do there as a research assistant is I help out with running tests for Dr. Agnetti. I run Western blots, basically comparing different samples of protein from different mice samples that were preconditioned in certain ways. For example, sometimes we precondition mice by, and it's very barbaric, I understand, that they basically cut off a lot of the blood supply to the heart to kind of stimulate a sort of heart failure experience. And then they, remove the stimulation of the mice, will go back to living normal. And then once we get the proteins that were created during that time, we compare with control groups, we find out the concentrations of specific proteins, and then we basically try to see which proteins were more present during each type of heart failure. But again, that's only in mice. So the work there is definitely evolving. Dr. Agnetti is definitely, he's focused more on the Desmond protein, but we're definitely branching out in the research more and more as we find more and more from our results. But it is a long process, and it's definitely rewarding when we get to really find a specific result, and we repeat an experiment and the same thing happens again. It gives us a lot of confidence, and it's extremely rewarding to find something like that in very hard research like this.
Yeah, no, it definitely sounds very rewarding, and I'm glad that you have the opportunity to do it. Even as an undergrad student, because I think at a lot of schools, a lot of students don't get to work on research until they're like a grad student. So this sounds like a really great opportunity for you. But you did mention that you're interested mostly in the brain, and you're obviously a neuroscience major. So what made you want to work in a heart lab, and do you plan on transitioning to a more neuroscience focused lab in the future?
To be very frank with you, both David and Julian, I picked that lab because that was the lab that emailed me back the quickest. So basically the process of trying to find research or participate in research as a pre-medical student, I've heard is very grueling, and it's a lot of rejection filled in with a couple of rewarding experiences. At Johns Hopkins, because there's so much research going on, it's not that hard for us to find research that easily. So I emailed 4 people, all in different studies. One was GI, one was focused on neuropharmacology, but Dr. Agnetti was the only one that emailed me back after I sent him my resume. We set up an interview. He showed me his research. I was really interested by it. And, we connected, and that was it. He took me into his lab, and I started learning how to do things little by little. The fact that it was cardiology wasn't really something that I looked for. The heart is very interesting to me, though, and this research is extremely interesting to me, and it's really drawing me in. It doesn't take my focus away from the brain, and I do believe eventually in the future, of course, it's part of my major. I have to work in a neuro lab eventually, but I do want to, and I'm very excited to do that. But I've made connections with Dr. Igniti and the two other research assistants there, Krishna and Kenny. I'm really close with them too now, so it would be hard for me to leave them. So the only way I think I would be able to do that other neuroscience research is if I could do both labs at the same time, which is a journey I'll probably undergo my junior year. I'll probably look into getting into a neuro research lab probably the summer leading into junior year, and then work in that lab through that summer and my junior fall and spring. And just because of the fact that I want to take physics over that previous summer, so that leaves a huge chunk of time for my junior year. So I was thinking of dedicating that huge chunk of time to another lab. That way I would be able to juggle these two labs at the same time and not stress as much.
Yeah, I mean, sounds like you all got it planned out. 2 labs at the same time, though. That's pretty interesting. That's definitely a challenge, I think, right? Like managing your time during that period of time.
Oh, yeah, of course. And especially by then, a lot of our work as research assistants really gets done by Krishna because she's a senior and she understands everything going on in the lab and she's super smart. She makes the PowerPoints that we eventually present to Dr. Agnetti every 2 or 3 weeks. So, and that keeps up with our progress. So he knows what's going on and he can tell us the next steps ahead. So, of course, a lot of that responsibility by my junior year, Kenny would have graduated too because he's an upcoming senior now. By then, it would fall onto me. But I believe by then, without the stress of physics, because physics is honestly my worst branch of science, without that stress, I think I would be able to do it. It would just, of course, it would take time and commitment, but 2 labs at the same time, if you balance them and you don't procrastinate, it's certainly doable. And if you don't have too much other stuff going on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that with your preparation and everything, that I think that's definitely doable. Oh, by the way, I hate physics. Like, I'm just gonna say that right now. I don't want to go too much into it, but physics it's really difficult, man. God,
I am terrified to take it here, man. I
Dude,
hear
it's
that loud
hard.
and clear.
Yeah, no, I think I mean, you're a life and social sciences major, so you should be okay, because the bio for those majors are easier, but the one for physics and engineering majors, oh my God, awful.
I hope so. I haven't taken physics since freshman year of high school, so
Yeah,
I'm just
not
crossing
fun.
my fingers.
Yeah, and speaking of research, I'm also doing research, but your research, I think, probably a lot more formal than mine. I work in kind of like an engineering lab, so it's definitely not like as formal because I don't think we're dealing like with, live animal test subjects or anything. And we're not doing any wet work. I think it's like a dry lab. I think that's what you would call it. Just dealing with data and that sort of stuff. So it's definitely not as bad. But yeah, I think our research experiences are both pretty interesting and they're pretty different, even though we're both doing, quote unquote research. I think my experiences have been pretty interesting. It's been really irregular. Like I don't work normal hours and everything's very much relaxed. It's interesting. But I'm glad that I was able to get the opportunity to do research here. And I don't know how I know you said that it was really difficult to get your research. Was that correct?
It wasn't as hard as it may be in other schools, but I mean,
Yeah.
I only sent like 4 emails. It wasn't really that hard.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, the people I've talked to, I don't know. I mostly talk to engineering majors, obviously, so I'm really biased here. But the people I've talked to, they got into research labs like super easily. But I'm aware that pre-med labs may be a little bit harder to get into because it's more competition.
Of course, and research is so diverse no matter where you go. There's engineering research, as you said, there's wet labs and dry labs for that. There's wet labs and dry labs for any kind of research. And there's even research in anthropology where students are taking trips to Oman, Yemen, in the Middle East with their professors. But of course, that kind of research, you really have to be close with your professors to be invited to that. Same thing with economic research. So every background of these, every background of research that you go into has their specific set of, I suppose, prerequisites, something that you would need to get in. Engineering research, it may not be that hard to get in at an entry level. For my major and for pre-med, it's not that hard either. But for perhaps the humanities, the humanities and the arts, it can be a lot harder to get into those kinds of research because it's so specific and it's such small groups that the only way you could get in really is if you have a connection with the professor and with the other people there and with the topic, which is something which all three of those I had no connection with whatsoever until I got into the interview.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting point that you bring up, that there's obviously multiple different types of research. I never even thought of humanities research before, but I know that one of our friends actually is doing humanities research specifically in political science, and I think that's really interesting. I think she's doing it on voting patterns, if I'm not mistaken. But it's definitely interesting because people think of research as like, okay, you're sitting down in a lab and you have these test tubes everywhere and you're using a pipette and everything. But I mean, my lab has nothing to do with that, and I'm aware that most of the labs on campus have nothing to do with that. I mean, some of the more traditional labs may resemble that, but yeah, research is definitely very different nowadays, and there's so much cool research that you can do in a variety of fields. So it's very interesting, and I'm glad that I have the opportunity to do it. I mean, Hopkins is just like absolutely astounding when it comes to that. Like, I was able to find opportunities really quickly.
There's another part to that too, and I just want to jump in here about research. There are a lot of people out there who are sort of put off by the idea of research because it just seems so difficult, like so high in terms of effort and mental ability, just sort of the standard that's required in order to conduct research. And in many respects, that's true, but you'll be surprised at what research actually entails for different fields, right? And depending on the field, the research that happens can be pretty interesting and also very approachable as well. I think from my research experience, I was analyzing networks, so social networks, the connections that people make between other people, and we started evaluating. We put a number as to the importance of a particular relationship because it just links it. That relationship might link two very large communities of people together, that one link. So that one link would be considered very important. And it turns out the algorithm to figure that sort of information out is very slow and very computationally expensive. And my professor wanted to find a newer, faster algorithm that gives you the same sort of accuracy, but it just runs faster and it's just computationally less expensive, right? So that sort of thing, like all of that terminology I just gave out there seems like, that's going to be tough to do, right? Because what is research? You're disseminating new knowledge. You're creating knowledge, or at least you are helping somebody create new knowledge. And that just seems so bizarre, right? Is that you feel like, you read all these textbooks, you go to university, there's literal PhDs out there of people who just study and read and learn to the end of days, they become PhDs. So haven't we already discovered all we needed to discover? Or, haven't people already discovered everything that needs to be discovered, And that's actually not true. There's actually a lot out there in the world that we don't understand yet, or we don't know how to do. So a lot of research out there, there's still a lot to be learned about the world and, its phenomenon. And there's also a lot of research out there that is a great deal more approachable than you might think. So don't be afraid to try to go for some research opportunity if it's something that is in the cards, right? If it's something that's gonna move your plans forward. If you're planning on going into grad school or you're going for a PhD program at some point, right? Research is pretty vital in applying to those sort of schools and those sort of programs. So if research is important, then don't be afraid to jump in, ask different professors that you've built relationships with, and to see if there's a research opportunity out there so that you can develop those sort of skills. And maybe if you're lucky, at the end of the day, you might contribute enough to be able to publish with your name, with your professor on that bit of research. And at that point, you're a published researcher, which I think is cool.
Yeah, of course. I think that's a huge point that anyone listening to this podcast should take with them. They should take your point, Julian, that you shouldn't be scared to go into research, because I was very scared going into that, cardiological biochemistry lab. Like, you don't even know what that really means walking into it. But research is something you can't really learn in a classroom setting. It's something you learn while doing, and you have people there. You'll never join a lab where there's no one above you. You'll join a lab where there's people above you that know what to do, and they'll instill that knowledge into you. So you have nothing to worry about. I never knew how to run a Western blot test, and I was showed many times, and now I know how to do it. It's something like that that may discourage many people from research, but trust me, if you have the right people in the lab, which you'll always have someone above you that can teach you stuff, don't be shy, ask for help, and you'll learn how to do research in whatever field you wish to do. And a lot of these professors are looking for people to do research with them. And when they're looking to when they're looking for undergrads to help them with their research, they can be very generous. And in the case of my professor, the one that I'm working with, he puts our names in papers that he publishes while we're there. And that's something that's huge for an undergraduate. So you can even get rewarding benefits such as that from research. So I urge everyone to please take Julian's point. Do not be afraid to go into research.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. So aside from research, what other activities are you pursuing outside of the classroom right now?
Well, at my first semester while at Hopkins, I did a lot of musical stuff. I was in Peabody for that first semester. I was playing in a jazz combo. I was getting lessons for that. That definitely took some time, and it was very enjoyable. I love playing and performing my instrument. My primary instrument is bass, and I really love playing and just, it's a de-stressor for me. When I'm stressed about everything, I can kind of just vibe with my bass and really let go a lot of stress that way. But other than that, spring semester came and I didn't really have time for it anymore, so I dropped it for a semester. I'm still unsure if I'll go back, but I really got into Greek life. And right now I'm in a fraternity. Actually, the fraternity I'm in, we just restarted our fraternity, and I'm a founding father. I'm one of the members there to help establish it, turn it from an interest group into a colony, into a full-on chapter. And this semester I'll actually be a rush chair, helping to recruit the new freshmen that we need. But Greek life has always been something that has had me a little nervous about because of the negative speculation it gets on TV, but it really is a rewarding experience once you get yourself into it, and it's really not as crazy as you may think, at least at Hopkins. You really find people that you really bond with and that you're really close to. And I found that a lot with, my now brothers. I have a lot of close relationships with all of them, and I would do a lot for them, from the majority of them, the majority of them that I really know. But other than that, I am a resident advisor now, so residential life has been taking up some of my time too, learning how to approach new incoming freshmen or current sophomores, trying to organize programs, that kind of thing. I do tutor here and there outside of the classroom. I certainly like to party. I love to have a good time. That's the thing about being pre-med. You need to enjoy your time at college too. I'm just throwing this out there because of the fact that I know if someone hears this, they might think I'm not that great of a pre-medical student, but I have a 4.0 GPA and I'm doing great. But I'm not throwing my whole life into my academics. I have all the time in the world to do that in medical school and during my residency. But for now, I can enjoy my time. I can get that 4.0, but also have fun with my friends. David, we've spent countless nights hanging out in one of our dorm halls, common areas, either studying or hanging out, just talking with other people, sometimes just us. And it's important to hold on to those moments because it shouldn't always just be about school. You should enjoy your life, and you should do other things besides schoolwork. Like, in my case, perform or be a part of a group larger than yourself, like a fraternity, or become a resident advisor, help other people that were struggling, become a tutor. I'm a pilot leader now, so I'm also a tutor on some days for calculus too. So a lot of it is, you shouldn't really just focus on your academics. You should really branch yourself out, diversify yourself, and learn how to have a good time. Try new things. You know, when I went to hot pot with you guys, David, I never had hot pot before in my life. The food I've had from Asian culture, the most of it has been takeout and some restaurants or buffets, but I've never really had hot pot, and that was like a next level for me. And that's something I learned. That's something I'll carry with me throughout my life that I experienced. And if I were more focused on academics than creating experiences for myself, I wouldn't have gone out with you guys that night. I would have studied for the next exam in a few days. So I really think activities outside of the classroom are so important, especially for someone in pre-med, because you're going to have all the time in the world to study in medical school, and you'll have all the time in the world to stress and really work hard during your residency. And you should work hard and you should do well while in college, but remember to take that little breather and remember to have some fun along the way too.
Yeah, you brought up a really great point there, which is don't let your academic life consume you, right? I know a lot of people, including myself sometimes, I definitely make that mistake sometimes, but I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, you're not just in college to learn and, you know, just to study and hit the books and get into medical school or pursue whatever you are going to do in the future. I mean, you have plenty of time for that. Yeah, definitely enjoy your college experience as well. I mean, don't go like wild and party every night, but you know, take some time to yourself and have some fun, because you're never going to get this experience of going to college again. And it'll also, I think, make you more productive in the sense that, you know, if you're spending all of your time studying, you're eventually going to get bored. You're going to experience burnout, like we talked about earlier, and you're just not going to have a really great time. And that's going to, you know, reduce your motivation, and you're not going to even want to spend any more time, you know, doing your physics homework or your biology homework or whatever. So I think it's really important that you take those moments and take those breathers and have some fun. Definitely a great point.
Yeah, and I want to jump in here because I think this is one of the times where I have some unique perspective to add, because I've already graduated from my undergrad education. I'm in my master's right now and I'm a working professional. So I've already graduated from all the undergrad, like college life. That's over for me, right? So since I have eclipsed that, I believe I have some unique perspective here to add to this conversation. Let me tell you what happens when you let academics consume the entirety of your life and you end up doing 0 activities, or maybe you do like 1 or 2 activities, which is good. That's a good step. But you don't take time for yourself, or you don't do anything that relaxes you, that takes the edge off, right? And you don't have fun. You don't enjoy yourself. Let me tell you what happens when you do that. When you do get out of your undergrad, once you finish college, and that's all over, once you get to where I am, and then now that you do have the time to have fun, and let's say you do decide to have fun, let's say you pull out a game, or you decide to hang out with friends, or you decide to do something else, whatever you want to do that is, you know, gonna take the edge off, help you relax, help you take your mind off of work or whatever it is you're dealing with in your adult life, you're gonna get this really unnerving feeling that you're doing something wrong. Like, I'm having fun right now, but that shouldn't be allowed. Like, I shouldn't be doing this. And that's a terrible feeling to have. And let me tell you, that's a feeling that I have nearly every single time I decide to have fun. And I've worked through that, and I'm getting better at not having that feeling. But it is certainly a very unhealthy feeling to have. And that's not to say that I didn't have fun in college, because when I think about college, like I made a lot of really close friends that I still keep up with to this day. They're like my best buds. And we have game nights together. We still hang out together, or at least when we could hang out. We could, you know, hang out. We did. And that was great. I had a lot of fun in college. But prior to that, in high school, I was taking all these AP classes, perhaps not as many as other people, but I still allowed school to sort of consume me. And then in freshman year, when I didn't know anybody, because I ended up moving to another city where I didn't know anybody, in freshman year, since I didn't know anybody, I didn't have any friends to begin with, I did let school consume myself. So for the entirety of the first year, school was life. I didn't join any clubs because I lived off campus, so clubs was hard for me to jump into. So stayed home. I studied, did homework, studied some more, and then year 2, year 3 goes by. I graduate, and then now I'm stuck with this weird, awful feeling of like, oh, I'm having fun right now. I'm relaxing, but I shouldn't be because that's wrong, and somehow I should be doing something productive or something that's gonna move me up in life, whatever that means, right? And that's a terrible, unhealthy feeling. So that's what happens when you allow academics to sort of creep in and take over your entire life. Now, Joey, you sound like a guy who has a very, very balanced life, right? You obviously focus on academics. You take it seriously because you have a 4.0 GPA, but you also have a great sense of boundary, right? You respect your own time and you respect your own energy enough to be able to establish those boundaries and have fun when you need to have fun. And that's huge. So props to you, first of all. And second of all, everybody who's listening out there, do that. Like, have some balance, incorporate some fun, incorporate some relaxing time for yourself, because that's just so important. And you're going to thank yourself later on, because then in your adult life, when you do have the time and money to have fun, then, and you do take that opportunity, then it's great. You feel great. But if you're like me, you're going to start feeling guilty when you shouldn't be. And that's just weird, unnerving, and it's uncomfortable. And it's also really unhealthy.
Yeah, Julian, that's a huge point. Thank you for the props on that. That's something that I struggled with finding. When I came to college, I was so focused on making my parents and my family proud, but I realized that I could do that and live my life a little bit. And it's very hard for people to do that. It's not something easy that you can just jump into. I'm a social person naturally, so it was easy for me to find that kind of those kind of opportunities. But for some people that may want those same opportunities that may not be as social in any way, it's a lot harder for them. And for them, it's a lot more of a process instead of a flip of a switch. So to those people, I really hope, you decide to lay less on the academics and really start focusing on enjoying your life each and every day instead of stressing about it. And of course, focus on school, focus on your academics, because they will get you. They'll be a big part of what gets you where you need to go. But focus on your personality too, because your employer nowadays likes to see a diversified background. Not only diversified in your field, but that you did stuff here and there. It's a nice highlight on your job application. Like, at some point, I want to bartend. My dream is pediatric neurosurgery, but at some point, I want to be a bartender. I don't care if it's for a week, a month, half a year. I want to bartend. And I think it'll look nice on my application, but I really want to do it just to do it. So I think people should have those kind of little flings here and there in your life where you look back and you realize you lived a really interesting story.
Yeah, definitely agree there. But obviously, you've mentioned a lot of stuff now. You have a really rigorous academic schedule. I mean, you're getting a 4.0 at Johns Hopkins University. Like, that's no joke, like that's pretty tough to do, even if you're not doing anything else. So you're doing that, and then you obviously are working in a lab right now. You're in a fraternity. You did, music for a while, and now you dropped it, and you're now pursuing a residential life, and you're going to become a pilot tutor too. So how do you find the time to actually balance that all those activities? How do you balance your academic life with your extracurriculars without going insane and not getting any sleep?
That's a very good point, David. I have a problem with that, to be honest with you guys. Sometimes I can bite off a little more than I can chew. I think I know my limit, but I don't think I've fully grown and matured enough to truly understand my limit. But the way I balance all of this, everything you said, the way I balance all of it is through two things. The first is when it comes to academics, I study the way I previously mentioned before, making things a second nature to me, a common sense more type of thing, not memorizing everything and killing a bunch of time like that. That's my one big way. The second big way I really go about this is I make a schedule. I separate all of my academic work throughout the week, and I also include in there my important lab meetings, the days I have to go to lab, when I have my residential life meetings, or when I'm pilot tutoring, that kind of, I have to fit that in there. And when I make that schedule, I don't necessarily stick to it all the time, but I always get everything on that schedule done, whether it's on the day I originally intended for it to get done or whether it's not. I think you have to be disciplined when you make a schedule for yourself. You don't have to be disciplined to the point where everything you schedule for yourself each day is what you need to get done, because it's real life. We're all human. Sometimes we give ourselves more than we can take, and some days we wake up feeling more gloomy than other days. Some days I don't feel like doing as much work as I assigned myself. And you know what I'll do on those days? I'll do maybe 3/4 of the work, and the other quarter, I'll push it until tomorrow. And I understand how that's dangerous and how people can fall into that pattern where they keep pushing stuff off and eventually never get it done. But that's the part where you have to be disciplined. I don't think you have to be disciplined in where you get stuff each day. You get stuff done each day that you intended for it to be done that day. I think you need to be disciplined in the fact that you need to get all of this stuff done at this certain deadline. Follow your schedule to some extent, but make sure it's all done by that deadline. And that's actually what I do. I have my little notes app on my iPhone. I'll put Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, Sunday, I'll write down everything I have to do for each day. I'll separate them all, and I'll see if it's balanced. And if I have to push it off because of an emergency, or I just don't feel like something, or if I want to hang out that day instead, or if I want to sleep in that day, if that happens, I'll push it. I won't push the whole day. I'll do most of the work, and I'll push a little bit. So I think that's a really big thing, keeping a schedule and trying to be disciplined with it, but don't kill yourself over it. Be disciplined in the fact that you get the stuff done, not that you get it done that day. Just get it done before your major deadline, whether it's an exam or the end of the semester, that kind of thing, which changes on every individual case.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that advice is really important. I mean, personally, I make a schedule for myself too. I use mostly Google Calendar to do that. And obviously the UniPlan app is where I plan on doing that in the future. But yeah, it's really important to keep a schedule. I do kind of like not hourly blocks per se, but like, within a few hours, like I plan on doing certain activities during that time. And I make a pretty like strong commitment, but not a really like hardcore, like, okay, I'm going to finish that. And I definitely agree with you on that. Like, you can't be too strict with your deadlines, but you definitely can't be too loose either, or else, you're never going to finish stuff. But I think it is important to have discipline. I think it is really important to have a schedule, a plan that you want to follow, because if you don't, then you never really know when you're going to do things, and you're always going to end up finishing them at the last second, which is really, really bad. You should always try to get as much as you can done early, so you can get that out of the way. Julian, you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I know you're like really, meticulous about your time management.
Oh yeah, I got this from another like productivity guru. This quote that I'm about to say, it's that my calendar is sacred. Whatever is on my calendar is going to happen. And while that isn't like 100% true all the time, because like, what is a schedule if you can't move things around, or when things need to be shuffled around, right? I sort of, that stuff moves around all the time. But the point remains, I do live off of my calendar quite a lot. And calendars are useful for me as opposed to to-do lists, because there's a time attached to whatever task that I need to get done, right? A to-do list is sort of, it's dynamic in that you can keep adding to it and you can cross things off. And there's a level of satisfaction that comes from crossing a to-do list item off. And, I'm all for that. But it's another thing entirely to have a really long to-do list that looks scary. There's, you don't know where to begin, right? Like you can start on hypothetically any item on this to-do list. So like, where do you even start? And then you start thinking about, where do I even start? And then it just gets too scary of a thought, and then you end up procrastinating or end up doing something else. Dangerous idea, right? But I'm sure that's something that has happened to everybody on this show right now, and also everybody listening to this show right now. So it's normal, it's okay. The solution for me has been to move from a to-do list to a schedule that I make up. Sometimes it happens the day of, the morning of. I wake up, I'm like, okay, let's think of a schedule, and that's fine. The optimal way to think of a schedule is to do it the night before, so that you get all the thinking out of the way of scheduling, and then when you wake up, it's sort of like, okay, I can flip on the autopilot switch, just stare at my schedule and follow whatever's on my calendar. The beauty with that is, whatever's on your calendar, there's a time block for it. There's a start time and an end time. And you look at the clock and it's, oh, it's that time already. All right, time to do this thing that's on my calendar. It's really easy. And then the really great thing is that once the time is over, you get to decide, like, okay, well, I'm not finished with my task right now. Do I have extra time on my schedule to finish it? It might take like 10, 15 more minutes. Okay, I can do that. If not, then you can reschedule it and then move on to do the next thing on your schedule, right? So even if you don't finish, at least you've made progress on whatever you decided to work on. And then you can make progress on other things that are on your schedule. And that's what I think is the greatest thing about scheduling in your calendar and using a calendar. It's the one thing that's the most valuable to me. So I guess, if you can take anything away from this show at all, it's use a calendar, because the time blocking idea is huge and it's so helpful. And it's just a great way to mentally create boundaries as to where one task begins and another task, ends, right? And that's important. So use a calendar. It's, I said in the beginning of this spiel, my calendar is sacred, and it really is.
Yeah. So final question for you, Joey. What is your advice for someone who is looking to go into medicine?
Don't give up. That to me is huge. Recently working at a nursing home, I won't specify the name of the home, but a lot of the staff there wasn't supportive. And I was licensed as a temporary nurse aide throughout the just for the duration of the pandemic, because to be a certified nurse aide, it requires around 75 hours of schooling. But I was a temporary nurse one, got my 8-hour online degree and went there and started working. But when I worked there, being a nurse aide, about half of the nurses I met, very nice, very understanding, always willing to help. The other half, though, were rude, mean. They always had to demonstrate they were smarter than you, that they were in control. And I think that can really push someone out of the medical field, because no matter what field you want to go into, in my case of pediatric neurosurgery is what you would call the top of the food chain at a hospital. Those people that are pediatric neurosurgeons are so far and few in between. They can really, in a sense, do whatever they want, because they'll always find a job somewhere else. I mean, of course, not if they can't start going through things like medical malpractice and lose their license. That's completely different, but they don't get pushed around, is what I'm trying to say. Whereas people below them, such as nurses, nurse aides, they can get pushed around. But when you come to a nursing home standpoint, and usually in hospitals, nurses fall at the bottom of the totem pole, which shouldn't be reality. Nurses have my utmost respect. They do a ton of work, and they have a ton of stress on their shoulders, having the patients in their care all the time. But when you put some of those nurses in nursing homes and they have someone under them, they take out a lot of their frustration on those people under them, just because they can, which is unfortunate. And you know what? It's not just nurses. Doctors take out their frustrations on their nurses sometimes. Surgeons take out their frustrations on their surgical residents and on their surgical nurses too. It goes down that way. But to anyone going into medicine, please don't be discouraged by that. I've had many of my fair share of run-ins with rude nurses and terrible administration at the home that I worked at that wanted me to do things that were, in a sense, very shady against their own policies, but just because they wanted to cut corners and save money, they wanted me to do them. But I would never advise someone to be discouraged by this, because I've also worked at a local hospital, Trinitas Regional Medical Center, and the nurses there were some of the best nurses I've ever met in that ICU. They, as a medical student, they took their time while people were coding, while people were flatlining, and they had to scramble and do what they needed to do with their crash carts. They took the time throughout. One of them would always take the time throughout all of that, at least one of them. And it wasn't always the same one either. Would always take the time throughout all of that chaos to explain to me what was going on step by step. And I think that shows that you can really meet bad nurses and great nurses. You can meet amazing physicians, terrible physicians. You can meet great surgeons, bad surgeons. And I think it's something that hit me, that made me feel I shouldn't be discouraged by these rude, nasty nurses that I'm meeting at this home, because I met other nurses that outshine them by a million stars. So for anyone going into medicine, please, unless you give up on your own and you decide on your own that the field wasn't for you because you would rather do something else, go for it. Be happy. Live your life with no regrets. But don't give up medicine because you were discouraged by someone that's higher up than you right there. Instead of being discouraged, use it as fuel and as motivation to prove that one day you will be better than them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely good advice for any career, but for the medical field in particular. I mean, I have a lot of relatives and a lot of friends who are currently working in the medical field, and it's really hard. I mean, I think part of the reason is because obviously you're trying to save lives on a daily basis, and that adds a lot of pressure. That adds a lot of pressure to doctors. That adds a lot of pressure to administrators, to the nurses, to everyone. And if you're working and you're under the supervision of someone else, they can get cranky at you for no reason, and that's maybe just because their day has been really terrible as well. And so I think it's really important that you don't let that affect you. In medicine, it's all about resilience and having thick skin and being tough. I know that's the case in really in any field, because you're always going to have the higher ups. You're always going to have people who are putting pressure on you, but in medicine particularly, because there are lives at stake, it's definitely pretty challenging. But Joey, like, would you agree with me that medicine is probably one of the most rewarding fields as well, because you do have the opportunity to save lives and to help people?
Of course, I have to agree with that. That experience is rewarding more than none other. While I was at the local hospital where I volunteered at and learned at as a medical student, we had a patient in that ICU, in that intensive care unit, that their oxygen level, their oxygen saturation was going down little by little throughout the hour. You're supposed to have 95 to 99% O2 saturation in your blood. This woman was dropping 95, 94, 93, 92. And at one point she was 82, which is very low. And me and the resident on call that night and I, because I was shadowing him at the time, we looked through doctor's notes before, because you look at the attendings before you that saw the patient before, and you look at their recommendations to see what you should do. And I happened to glance at a specific cardiologist's notes, and he said something along the lines, please do not give this person any antidiuretics. Please do not, antidiuretics, which basically retain water in the individual. And I remember seeing in the room a specific drug. I forgot the name of the drug. It starts with an L, but this drug was in the room, and I showed it to the resident. I said, was that an antidiuretic? Because if this lady, I'm thinking in my head, if this lady has an antidiuretic, she's retaining fluid, her blood volume is higher, she has more blood in her body, and her heart's working harder to pump that blood when her heart isn't even strong. And all of that work itself can lower the O2 saturation. I told him, and he said, yeah. So they immediately got her off of it. They did a ton of work, and this poor woman was a drug overdose, and she was sitting in the ICU only at 45, 50 years old. And I heard eventually she became better and she was able to leave. And that's been my most rewarding experience in medicine so far. Of course, I didn't do anything. I pointed out one thing. That was it. The nurses that went in there that helped her, the residents that went in there and kept her alive after I left that night are the ones that are the heroes. But I had a little bit of a taste of it. And that's something that I found to be truly rewarding. When I want to go into the field of when I eventually go into the field of pediatric neurosurgery, that field is so rewarding, but it's also got a lot of loss in it. But I truly believe that the rewards in that field, especially when you're dealing with children and giving a child, for example, like a 4-year-old child, ridding them of their brain cancer and letting them live until the age of 70 when you're not even around, is the most rewarding as life can get.
Yeah, I mean, I think that about does it. Do you have anything else you want to say, Julian?
No, I think we can close it out here.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for listening to the Study Space podcast. As always, the show notes with links and everything we mentioned in this episode for further reading and learning are on our website at uniplan.dev. We know that there are countless podcasts being published every day, and you have decided to listen to ours in particular. It really means a lot to us that you've given us your time to listen to two students ramble on about school. If you want to show support, give us a rating or tell a friend about it. Your testimonial to your friends and family is the most helpful thing that you can do for us. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. That's it for this one. We'll see you next time on the Study Space podcast.